Throughout the entire history of the sport, there have been several teams who reached an elite status in club football. But like the old saying goes, what goes up must come down. For various reasons that I'm gonna explain in this video, the clubs that I will show you today completely fell off and are currently unable to match their levels from back in the day. So join me as we take a deep dive into the 10 biggest teams who fell off. Make sure you stay until the end because there will be some controversial takes that I can't wait to discuss with you. So without further ado, let's get right to it. Starting out with Saint-Étienne. It might come off as a surprise to you, but up until the end of the past season, Saint-Étienne was still the club with the most Ligue 1 titles alongside PSG. Les Verts dominated French football in the 60s and 70s. In fact, almost all of their accolades, including their 10 league titles, were conquered during that period. They were fueled by a golden generation of players such as Hervé Révélí, Robert Herbin and Georges Beretta that even managed to reach the European Cup final. But unfortunately, Saint-Étienne faced Bayern Munich, arguably the best team in the world in 1976, and lost 1-0 in a hotly contested match that saw several Saint-Étienne players miss various goal-scoring chances. To make it worse, that would be their ultimate chance at European glory, as by the time the 80s rolled around, their president Roger Rocher was involved in a huge corruption scandal that led to a complete downfall in the club. Up until the early 2000s, Saint-Étienne were promoted and relegated in different instances, permanently losing their status as France's top team. Nowadays, they're in another slump, desperately looking for a buyer while they play in the country's second tier. At number 9, we got Hamburger SV. Nowadays, they're just that unlucky team from Germany who seems to bottle promotion back to Bundesliga every year. But let's not forget that up until their relegation, they were the only team that had played in every edition of the Bundesliga since its foundation in 1963. Besides, during the mid-70s until the mid-80s, Hamburg were the best German team and one of the best in the entire planet, having players in the ranks such as Felix Magath and Kevin Keegan. Guided by legendary coach Ernst Happel, the Red Shorts won the European Cup, 2 Bundesliga titles and the DFB Pokal. But in the following decade, the club would be drawn in debts that prevented them from reaching that level again. At least, they were consistent enough to remain in the Bundesliga and to occasionally qualify for the Champions League. However, in the 2010s, it became a norm to fight relegation battles almost until the last match day, and in 2018, the inevitable happened, and their iconic clock that represented the number of days that they had spent in the Bundesliga was finally stopped. Number 8. Santos. As an European football fan, it's very easy to get lost in our continental history due to the sheer amount of historical teams that Europe has produced. But during a 20-year period, no European team was superior to Santos. From the mid-50s until the mid-70s, Santos dominated football and became the defining symbol of the beautiful game, prioritizing technique, discipline, but also flair in their style of play. Os Fantásticos became the first team in the world to win a continental treble in 1962, while completely dominating the Brazilian game at the same time. In fact, much of Brazil's World Cup success in 1962 and 1970 was due to Santos, as their base squad came predominantly from the black and white team, similarly to Barcelona in Spain in 2010. Santos was so immensely popular that they became football's first globe-trotting team, as millions of football fans paid good money to see Pelé and company play. Those friendly matches were so important that they won't stop the war in Africa to watch a game, and many European teams would borrow a lot from Santos and evolve their own tactics due to those same matches. But everything must come to an end, and as the generation of Pelé, Zito, Pep and others rolled off to the sunset, Santos were unable to efficiently replace them. In the early 2010s, we witnessed a small glimpse of the legendary days as Neymar inspired the club to 3 state championships and 1 Copa Libertadores. But as soon as Barcelona took their golden boy, the club immediately downgraded and have since come very close of getting relegated. Number 7. AC Milan. It's undeniable that AC Milan is and will continue to be one of the 3 biggest clubs in Italy. On the other hand, it is also obvious that the club is no longer one of the best teams in the world, despite their recent semi-final run in the Champions League. Back in 1986, the Rossoneri were almost bankrupt, until the future Prime Minister Silvio Berlusconi acquired the club and invested huge sums of money. That allowed the club to bring Dutch superstars such as Gullit, Van Basten and Rijkaard, who alongside coach Arrigo Sacchi transformed Milan from a very defensive side into a dominating and attacking team. That mentality led them to their most successful period, as in the following 10 years the Rossoneri would win 3 Champions Leagues, 5 Serie A titles and 2 Club World Cups. In the next seasons, although not as imposing, AC Milan would retain their status among the European elite, continuing to win several Serie A titles and the Champions League in 2 different occasions. But after 2011, the club entered a massive downward spiral. The Rossoneri spent 8 seasons away from the Champions League and finished 3 consecutive seasons in Serie A's mid-table. Nowadays, they seem to be on the rise, but without the financial power that they once had, it will be extremely difficult for Milan to ever match their best days. Continuing on with another Italian team, we got Parma. Before the 90s, Parma were relative unknowns in world football, but after the appointment of Nevio Scala and the investment from Parmalat, the club massively improved and went from a Serie B side to a title-winning squad. During their golden age in the 90s, Parma boasted the likes of Crespo, Zola, Asprilla and Buffon in their ranks, a golden generation that came short of winning the Serie A, but still won 2 UEFA Cups and 3 Coppa Italia titles. It was a short, but magical period that was enough to cement them as a historic Italian club, but it will come to an end following the financial meltdown of their parent company. In the past 20 years, it has been a rollercoaster ride for every Parma fan, as the club is either on the verge of a rebuild or in total collapse. Nowadays, they're playing Italy's second tier after having recently missed promotion in the playoffs. At number 5, we got Benfica. As a young Portuguese football fan, it's almost impossible for me to imagine a team from my country being among the European elite. Such is a vast contrast between our club's funds and pretty much every top team from the top 5 leagues. Nevertheless, back in the 60s, Benfica dominated their club's competitions, winning 8 out of 10 league titles and 3 Portuguese Cups. But it would be with their performances in Europe that Benfica would establish themselves as one of the best clubs from the 20th century. With a golden generation of players like Coluna, Aguas, José Augusto, and of course, Eusébio, the Eagles won back-to-back European Cups against Barcelona and against one of the greatest Real Madrid sides of all time. In the next decade, the club would continue to be a force to be reckoned with, reaching the late stages of the European Cup almost every time, but after a great financial crisis in the late 1980s, the club began to slowly lose its importance in Europe, culminating in a 10-year period where they didn't even win the domestic league once. Nowadays, the club is stable, but still far from what they were 60 years ago. Number 4. Leicester City. The Foxes' rise to Premier League glory was one of the most beautiful things that I've witnessed in my life. From surviving an almost guaranteed relegation in 2015 to winning the league the next year with a group of rejects coached by a man who was seen as a finished coach was poetic to say the least. And the best thing about Leicester was they weren't one-season wonders. They continued to build on their success and achieved a quarter-final finish in the next year's Champions League, while they also went on to have respectable performances in both the Europa and Conference League. Leicester would also win the FA Cup in 2021, and at the time, it seemed like year after year they were closing the gap on the Big Six. Unfortunately, we all couldn't be more wrong, as 2 years after missing on Champions League qualification for just 1 point, Leicester City got relegated to the Championship. The Foxes lost almost all of their most important players, and the future is uncertain, as Leicester need a rebuild, but don't have nearly as much funds as they once had. Number 3, Deportivo La Coruña. Although far from the level of Real, Barca, or even Atletico when it comes to trophies won, Depor is still considered a big team in Spain, who for the best part of 20 years either challenged for the title or for European qualification. They would constantly have big names in their squad, such as Bebeto, Macai, or Naibet, and those same teams not only won multiple Copa del Rey and Supercopa titles, but also the league. But in my opinion, what ultimately cemented their legacy were their performances against the big clubs. For example, Deportivo spent 18 matches without registering a single loss at home against Real Madrid, while in the Champions League, they would reach a historic semi-final run in 2004, where they beat AC Milan 4-0 at home. This past decade though has been a stark contrast to what they lived just a couple of years ago. In 2011, Depor got relegated to the second division, and although they would return to the top flight, what came back was a shadow of the once heroic team. In 2018, they would be relegated again, and in 2020, they would drop down even lower, this time to the third tier, in which they currently stay. Number 2, Manchester United. Once European giants, now a team who struggles to qualify for the Champions League. Of course, their downfall isn't as dramatic as the majority of the teams in this video, but the heights that United reached were also higher than what most clubs ever achieved. Until Sir Alex Ferguson's retirement in 2013, the Red Devils spent 22 consecutive seasons on the podium and won 13 Premier League titles, while at the same time, the club established themselves as European giants, winning 2 editions of the Champions League and 4 other European titles. It truly was a golden era under Sir Alex Ferguson that helped produce some of the finest footballers that the world has ever seen. But his departure also marked the end of an era and the beginning of a dark period in the club's history where the lows have been awful and the heights not that frequent and not as intense. Manchester United has since missed 5 Champions League editions in this 10-year period while suffering various embarrassing losses like the recent 7-0 thrashing at the hands of Liverpool. Let's see if Ten Hag can indeed be the man that turns things around. And finally, Barcelona. To some people, this pick can be seen as controversial considering that the club has just won a La Liga title, but to me, their downfall is clearly obvious. Even when Messi was around, Barca was still falling short in Europe in disappointing fashion, wasting goal advantages against Roma and Liverpool or getting humiliated by Bayern, while in the past 2 seasons the club didn't even get past the group stage. I don't know about you, but when I was growing up, nobody could touch Barca. With tiki-taka, they dominated club football and in a way, international football as well. It's gonna be an uphill battle if they want to recover their status among the European elite, as the club isn't in good financial shape, and the gap between what they can spend and what Real Madrid and the Premier League clubs can afford is getting larger and larger. Still, I believe that this fall won't be permanent because Barcelona, not only as a club but as a brand, still garners a lot of interest from fans and investors all around the world, much thanks to the legacy of their best player of all time, Lionel Messi. And that's it for the video. What other teams do you think I should have included? Let me know in the comments below and leave a like so I know that you want to see more content like this. Also, if you want to support the channel, make sure you subscribe so you don't miss another interesting football video. Thanks for watching until the end, I appreciate you and I will see you soon.